The Federal and SR Public Welfare Trust present the Pudukkottai Marathon 2025. This event is co-presented by Rupee Apex Group of Companies on Sunday, August 3.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jai Srinivas. Prime Minister Modi is all set to unveil a commemorative coin for one of India's formidable emperors, Rajendra Chola, one at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, as he marks his 1000th anniversary of his conquest of the Gangetic Plains. And joining me to discuss more is author Kamini Dandapani from the United States. Thank you very much for your time, Ms. Kamini Dandapani. Wonderful to have you on the Federal.
Thank you for
Let
having
me
me.
Thank you. So let me begin with you there. You've extensively researched and you've written a book on the Cholas, right? And and this particular conquest of the Gangetic Plains is kind of seen as a civilizational milestone right now. But what was its actual historical significance?
Okay, so I'll give you some context as well. Rajendra's Northern Campaign, as it is called, was one of
That's right.
great daring, adventure, and imagination, and it was a brilliant symbolic move. But let's first let me give you some big background behind this, why he even did this. The great enemies of the Cholas during Rajendra's time were the Western Chalukyas of the Deccan in present-day Karnataka. And both they and the Cholas were trying desperately to gain control of the Vengi region around the Godavari Delta in Andhra. Now, the Vengi king has died and there's a succession battle. Of course, like many kings of that time, they had many wives and therefore many princes who were trying to become the king. And one of these was Rajendra's own son-in-law. And so he was there, and the Western Chalukya king had his own candidate that he was trying to push. So obviously the two locked hands and battles were fought, and it was a very bloody battle, at the end of which Rajendra's son-in-law was put on the Vengi throne. But Rajendra was not one to stay quiet after this. He wanted to obtain revenge against those who had dared support his rival. So he marched north, into Kalinga, into Odisha, defeating the kings who had supported the Western Chalukya emperor. And having done that, his army swept further north into the Pala kingdom of Bengal, where they wrought havoc once again. And having done that, they brought back boatloads of Ganga water on ships that were shipped down the coast into Chola territory. I have to stress here that while Rajendra's armies enjoyed victories in these areas, they never actually there's nothing to show that they actually became part of Chola kingdoms. Okay, they just took a lot of loot, they took the water, and then they came back south. So why was this so important symbolically, this bringing the Ganga water? For the kings of medieval India, Bharatvarsha loomed large as the ideal kingdom. And the names that some of the Chola emperors gave themselves, Rajaraja, Rajadhiraja, Chakravarti, kind of fit into the mold of the ideal leader of the ideal kingdom. And many kings all over India kind of created symbolic Bharatvarshas, including Rajendra's own father, Rajaraja, who built the Brihadishwara temple, which he called Dakshina Meru. Now, Bharatvarsha has a Mount Meru and the Ganga river feeding it. So this is what Rajaraja did. His son Rajendra, of course, had to go even further. He brought the actual Ganga water down south, making, in his eyes and to the world, the Chola kingdom a true Bharatavarsha in everybody's eyes, not merely symbolically, but in reality. And by this action, he proclaimed himself a true world sovereign. So this is why I think Rajendra did it. And it was brilliant, strategically, symbolically, in every way.
That's very interesting what you said. But Gangaikonda Cholapuram has kind of similar architecture with that of Tanjai Brihadishwara temple, right? And Cholas during the reign had multiple capitals, and Tanjai was a capital when his father Rajendra's father Rajaraja Chola was ruling there.
Correct.
So and Rajendra Chola had to shift the capital to Gangaikonda Cholapuram. Right, so I'm sure it must have been truly close to his heart there. So, but why did he? You think he must have done that?
Yeah, that is a $1 million question, as they say. So he didn't have to shift it because Tanjavur was fine. It had the temple, it had everything running for it. So I think it makes for a really fascinating psychological study or character study to speculate on why Rajendra moved his operations entirely to a completely brand new place where there was nothing at all. Gange, the town there was just an empty tract of land, 70 kilometers away, building everything from scratch. And to my mind, this is probably one way that he could step out of his father's very, very, very large shadow to make a clean start, to assert that he was a man and leader in his own right. As long as he stayed in Tanjavur, he was kind of in that old milieu, and this is what I feel. Maybe he wanted to move away from the politics of Tanjavur. Maybe he wanted to be closer to Chidambaram, which, is a place revered by the Cholas. It was a very powerful place for them. Perhaps he wanted to appease the people of this new area and make them feel that he was a part of the kingdom. They were a part of his kingdom. Maybe it was all of these, but once established, Gangaikonda Cholapuram remained the Chola headquarters for the remainder of Chola rule. So I just feel it was his way of stepping out of his father's shadow and striking out on his own.
You also said that he had to bring gallons of water,
Yeah.
Ganga water there. You see,
Right.
because Ganga plays a pivotal role in Hinduism, right? So you think there is some kind of a spirituality associated with this act, or you see it's more of a calculated display of conquest?
I think exactly as you said, it's both. It's both an act of devotion and an act of dominance, and not merely symbolically. There have been plenty of symbolic acts, right? There are mythologies that say that the Kaveri River, which is the core part of the Chola territory, is actually the Ganga water that Agastya brought down in a pot. You have the Pallava sculpture at Mahabalipuram, Mamallapuram, called Arjuna's Penance, that tells the story of the river Ganga being brought down to earth by King Bhagiratha's penance, and by extension of by virtue of it being depicted in the Pallava's maritime capital to Pallava lands as well. So these were all symbolic things. When they tell these stories, it's more than telling a story. There's a symbolic message behind it all. But looks like Rajendra is not content with doing symbolic things. He went beyond mere symbolism and brought the actual waters down. It was customary for kings of those days to erect pillars to celebrate and commemorate grand campaigns. Rajendra again went beyond, and he created a lake from this waters, Ganga waters that he brought down. He called it a liquid pillar of victory. Jalajaya Stambam is what he called it. I think he wanted to show the world that whatever anybody else did, he did it on a grander and more daring scale. And I think he was inspired by his father in this.
Okay, interesting again. But if you really look at, compare Rajendra life with Rajaraja Chola, you see very clearly that, Rajendra's life is kind of less celebrated in public imagination. Why do you think, his legacy hasn't resonated, as strongly as it should have been? Because, everybody knows, the historians know, history knows that military expeditions with Southeast Asia and all that.
Poor Rajendra. I feel bad for him, how hard he tried. And yet, Rajaraja is the household name. And most people you ask will say Rajaraja was the greatest of the Cholas.
That's right.
The fact is that Rajaraja was the true trailblazer. He truly stepped out of the box and did things that no Chola king had ever done before. From the conquest of nearly all of peninsular India and much of Sri Lanka, I'm talking about Rajaraja here, he did his massive land survey and organization effort. He had his trade expeditions to China. And of course, the grandest of all, his absolutely fabulous temple, the likes of which had never been seen until that point. So Rajaraja set the bar very, very, very high. And Rajendra had to resort to extraordinary measures to exceed it, which he did. But for whatever reason, it is Rajaraja who has captured the public imagination. And I think books and movies like Ponniyin Selvan, there's that old Shivaji Ganeshan movie on Rajaraja, all that just cemented this, So he was first in many areas. And even though Rajendra did all these things, first name is the first person on the moon is who you remember. So it's a similar thing. Second.
Okay. Prime Minister Modi is all set to, sort of release this, commemorative coin, marking this historical event there. But how do you see the political embrace of one of, southern India's formidable emperors? How do you see it politically?
Well, I'm glad that Rajendra is getting the spotlight, because I feel the history of South India has been neglected for far too long. The South, too, has had some truly remarkable dynasties with extraordinary achievements. But we are one country now, and we should not dismiss the history of the South or the East or West or any other part of India as a regional history, which implies that these are somehow secondary or ancillary histories to a main narrative. So I'm glad that Rajendra is getting the spotlight now. But I'm also wary of making Rajendra or any other ruler more than what he was. For instance, he did not actually conquer the Gangetic plains. He was not a perfect human being. He, like any ruler or person, was a mass of contradictions, good and bad, and our history should present him as such instead of one dimensional, glorifying or vilifying, which is what we seem to want to do, just show one side of the story. We can admire these rulers for their phenomenal achievements against terrible odds, but also study the bigger picture and understand the context in which they functioned. We need to understand the times he lived in and not impose our modern biases, stereotypes, and sensibilities on him, and certainly not use him for political gain, which I feel would be a huge disservice to him and his legacy. But that said, I'm happy that he's getting the spotlight. I'm happy that India is going to learn about this great emperor. But I would also urge people to read beyond just the hagiography, and the full story is a far more interesting, far more compelling one than a one-dimensional one.
Okay, so what do you how do you see the inscriptions and sort of temple records? What do they actually tell about Rajendra Chola? Because you said we shouldn't be sort of celebrating, nor we shouldn't be vilifying somebody. They should be sort of where do you see the gaps when it comes to talking about his history?
Okay, so I would say think of Chola inscriptions like the modern social media profiles of today. Okay, filtered, curated, polished, exaggerated to present a certain image. So this is what you need to keep in mind when you study these inscriptions. The Cholas were master public PR people, and they had plenty to back it up, but they had to do it because theirs was a cutthroat, very unstable world. They were capturing and controlling territories that had traditionally belonged to other powers, and they had their work cut out for them to somehow create a cohesive kingdom out of this patchwork. Proclaiming their greatness on inscriptions was one way to do this. Actually, these inscriptions were mostly practical documents, recording transactions like gifts or sales of land or gifts to people or temples. So one part of these inscriptions covers all the minutiae of the transaction. It's very boring, like detailed step-by-step directions of how the transaction should be conducted. The other part of these inscriptions is called the Prashasti or Maikirti. It was a sort of preamble recording who made the transaction, for instance, the king, and listing all that person's achievements. And here the court poets often went in town on this, preferring, poetic flights of fancy to accuracy. Plus, they'd probably have their heads put on a platter if they said if they gave a sort of truthful version. And again, the inscriptions in this Prashastis are not very detailed. Things are often just mentioned or alluded to, and they tell just one side of the story. Often, inscriptions describing the same event from the other side will tell a very different story. So the idea was you need to present yourself in a certain way. And so you have to read both sides. You have to read the complete picture, read what the opposite side is saying, and then try and piece together a story. And you could still be wrong because this is 1,000 years later. A lot of it is just educated guesswork. So this is how we know much of what we know about the Cholas. And with this in mind, we should take those inscriptions in mind with a large pinch of salt, large handful of salt.
One last question there. As a writer who's deeply engaged in Chola history, what do you think is the one takeaway from Rajendra Chola's legacy that modern India most needs to reflect on?
I think, his was ambition in a good way. Don't, whatever you set out to do, you do it. So he was very goal oriented. And this I would say about many of the Cholas, Rajaraja and Rajendra. They thought outside the box. They didn't limit themselves to the status quo. If they had, we would not be talking about the Cholas today, And I think they were very meticulous, very organized. They were very particular about keeping records, whether you believe them or not, but everything was noted down. I think we have a lot to learn from them. And even we think that, PR, public relations, and, image building is a modern thing. No, they were masters at it. They really were. They understood the importance of symbolism. I think they had their finger on the pulse of their people. They knew how to appeal to them and what it took to get them on their side. So those are all things, these are lessons that are always relevant. And I do admire the Cholas for what they did, So they were they lasted several hundred years against very, very difficult odds. And they planned their successions. So there's a lot, they were very meticulous, and they thought outside the box, which seemed like two contradictory things, but I think they made those things work for them.
Ms. Kamini Dandapani, thank you very much for joining us on The Federal once again. Thank you.